Hello everybody, welcome then to this, which will be the 6th video on Blood Brothers, and really now the first video where we actually start with the close reading and annotation of the text proper, because it's interesting that structurally so far we've had the tableau and the prologue, which sort of sit outside the chronology of the play. If anything, they come from the ending of it. We then had the enormous flashback, the enormous analepsis, through the start of the Marilyn Monroe song that took us back, we think, perhaps 35 years to the beginning of Mrs Johnston's story. So this moment now is where the main chronology of the play begins. Now, the Marilyn Monroe song you'll see here is literally interrupted by the ellipsis there. They go, and at this point an irate milkman, the narrator, rushes in to rudely interrupt the song. Now straight away that's worth noting, because it's an example of this Brechtian feature of multi-rolling that we have mentioned, where the narrator is now playing the part of the milkman as well. And he begins by saying this: "Listen, love, I'm up to here with hard luck stories. You owe me £3, 17 shillings and 4pence, and either you pay up today, like now, or I'll be forced to cut off your deliveries." Now, this is interesting in a number of ways, contextually particularly. The play begins with milk being stopped, being taken away or denied to Mrs Johnston, who we know is pregnant, a pregnant woman. Now, straight away then, this is used to represent the cruelty of society and the way in which it fails to care for its most vulnerable. But there's a further allusion here. Now, in the early 1970s, so about 10 years before this, Margaret Thatcher, who was the Prime Minister, remember, at the time the play was published and performed, but in the early 1970s she was the Education Secretary, and as part of a round of cost-cutting measures, one of the things that she implemented was the stopping of free milk for all children in schools. And the newspapers at the time gave her the nickname Maggie Thatcher, Milk Snatcher. So straight away then the play begins with quite an obvious anti-Thatcherite little piece of satire here. In other words, for people like Willie Russell, Margaret Thatcher represented what he saw as being the cruelty of society, and we see it represented here, because the first thing that happens is milk snatching. Mrs Johnston begs and says, I said, look, next week I'll pay you. Next week never arrives around here, says the milkman. I'd be a rich man if next week ever came. But look, I start a job next week. I'll have money coming in and I'll be able to pay you. You can't stop the milk. I need the milk. I'm pregnant. This again just demonstrates, as we said, the vulnerability that we've already seen. In things like next week, I suppose you've got the contrast between the sort of optimism of these people who are trying to make ends meet, sort of tied in with the sort of weary reality of the milkman who believes that hope is futile. So Mrs Johnston goes on, but look, I start a job next week. I'll have money coming in. I'll be able to pay you. You can't stop the milk. I need the milk. I'm pregnant. Well, don't look at me, love. I might be a milkman, but it's got nothing to do with me. Now, you've been told, no money, no milk. And the milkman exits. Now, this then is an early bit of spas. Remember that Brechtian idea of fun, because it refers to a sort of popular joke, as it were, a popular stereotype, that milkmen are sexually promiscuous, because essentially they might visit lots of houses during the day when the husband might be absent. So it's kind of an old joke that they might have lots of affairs. That's what's being referred to here, hence the spas. So again, we see that entertainment side of Bertolt Brecht Bertolt Brecht's influence on Russell coming in here very early. And think about this, we're only a matter of a couple of pages into the play, and already Willie Russell has he's demonstrated his political sensibilities through the sort of critique of Thatcher. He's demonstrated his social criticism through the criticism of the way that society treats its vulnerable. He's got the kind of entertainment elements in as well. Early on, he's really establishing those credentials. But the milkman exits. Mrs Johnstone stands alone, and we hear some other kids off stage. The first one crying, "Ma'am, ma'am, the baby's crying. He wants his bottle. Where's the milk?" Another one, "Hey, ma'am, how come I'm on free dinners? All the other kids laugh at me." "Hey, mother, I'm starving, and there's nothing in. There never bloody well is." Now, again, this is significant, isn't it? Because if we think about the role of a parent, then I suppose in stereotypical terms, one of the first priorities is that that parent should be able to provide for the family. And of course, putting food on the table is a key part of that. So straight away, Willie Russell is using the absence of food here to symbolise the way that Mrs Johnstone is struggling. This is also used structurally later, because at the start of Act 2, it has references to, for example, to Mrs Johnstone making the tea and things like that. And so the fact that at that point she does have food to put on the table is used to demonstrate how her life seems to have improved. And if we think about what I mentioned in one of my previous videos about the tragic arc, the way that Mrs Johnstone's life does seem to improve, you can see that trajectory, in this case represented by just those two things about her ability to provide food. So, perfunctorily, i.e. without really meaning it very seriously, she says, "Don't swear, I told you." And we also start to see another important thing about Mrs Johnstone as a character here, this idea that she is a slightly ineffectual parent, essentially because she's unable to cope with the scale of what's required of her, alongside things like providing food for the table and working and so on. And we see more evidence of that later when we find out more about Sammy, for example. Anyway, more cries from the kids. "Mum, I can't sleep. I'm hungry. I'm starving. And me, ma'am. And me. And me." So yeah, it really just serves to emphasise that. Mrs Johnstone then now sings and says, "I know it's hard on all of you kids, but try and get some sleep. Next week I'll be earning, and we'll have lots of things to eat. We'll have ham and jam and spam and roast beef, Yorkshire pudding, Battenberg cake, chicken and chips, corned beef, sausage, treacle tart, mince and spuds, milkshake for the baby." There's a chorus of groaning ecstasy from the kids. Now, this I think is useful because it emphasises the simpleness of the needs that Mrs Johnstone, and by extension any other working class people, have, according to Willie Russell. The fact that she's not asking for caviar and champagne. All she wants is basic food to eat. It's a measure of her desperation, and again, it's a measure of the cruelty of society that she is unable to provide it. She goes on again, singing, "When I bring home the dough, we'll live like kings, like bright young things, like Marilyn Monroe, and we'll go dancing." And so, once again, you see how that motif returns again. Once again, still used in a positive and an escapist way. Now, that then is quite interesting because that section begins to present Mrs Johnstone as a character, and once again it also links quite a lot to Willie Russell's views about society. Mrs Johnstone hums a few bars of the song and dances a few steps as she makes her way to her place of work, Mrs Lyons' house. Now this is another example of the Brechtian use of staging, because in the space of a few steps across the stage, the space now represents a very different place. It goes on then, during the dance she acquires a brush, dusters and a mop bucket, and so we see that the job that she has got is as a cleaner. Now in a moment we'll find out about Mrs Lyons and her lifestyle. We find that she is a wealthy member of the middle classes. It's also worth noting that there is something interesting about Mrs Johnstone's job. Now, she could have any job, but it's significant that Willie Russell, by making her a cleaner, means that she is able to go between the classes, as it were. She sees what life is like for the people in the middle classes in a way that she wouldn't if she was working in a factory, for example. And it's that sort of point of contact that allows a lot of the problems in the play to develop. At any rate, Mrs. Lyons' house, where Mrs. Johnstone is working, Mrs. Lyons enters carrying a parcel, and so this is now another of the main characters that we meet. It's worth noting that Mrs. Lyons as a whole is drawn, I think, as a slightly less interesting and certainly a slightly less sympathetic character than Mrs. Johnstone, which sort of fits in with Willie Russell's political beliefs. So Mrs. Lyons begins, "Hello, Mrs. Johnstone, how are you? Is the job working out all right for you?" Mrs. Johnstone replies, "It's great, thank you. It's such a lovely house, it's a pleasure to clean it." And straight away we're starting to see the juxtapositions then between Mrs. Johnstone's home with its many children with no food to eat in contrast to this lovely house. Mrs. Lyons says, "It is a pretty house, isn't it? It's a pity it's so big. I'm finding it rather large at present." A couple of things there. First of all, emphasises the size of it and emphasises her wealth. But also the fact that she says that she's finding it rather large at present seems like quite an insensitive thing to say for someone who's living in a very crowded slum or near slum conditions. And I think that lack of self-awareness is again part of Russell's criticisms of the middle classes. Mrs. Johnstone, perhaps slightly taken aback by this, says, "Oh, yeah, with Mr. Lyons been away and that. When does he come back, Mrs. Lyons?" "Oh, it seems such a long time. The company sent him out then for 9 months. So, what's that? He'll be back in about 5 months' time." That detail there is worth noting. The fact that it's 9 months, of course, that's going to be symbolically significant. As soon as anyone ever tells you 9 months, in literature you should always think baby alarm, baby alarm. And we'll see details of that in a moment. And Mrs. Johnstone replies, "Oh, you'll be glad when he's back, won't you? The house won't feel so empty then, will it?" Now that's a reflection that I suppose Mrs. Johnstone very much longs for the idea of having a kind of a male figure around the house to help with money, to help with the childcare, and so on. We continue then. Mrs. Lyons begins to unwrap her parcel. The fact that, first of all, we see Mrs. Johnstone lacking things, without enough food, and we see Mrs. Lyons buying things, coming home with a parcel. Again, symbolically, I think it's used to emphasise the relative gap in wealth. Anyway, Mrs. Lyons continues and says, "Actually, Mrs. J, we bought such a large house for the children. We thought children would come along." "Well, you might still be able to." "No, I'm afraid. We've been trying for such a long time now. I wanted to adopt, but Mr. Lyons is, well, he says he wanted his own son, not someone else's. Myself, I believe that an adopted child can become one's own." Now, there's a few things to think about. In these early moments, overall, it's broadly possible to sympathise with Mrs. Johnstone as someone who is lonely, who is childless, and so on. Particularly if we think about the pressure that society sort of places on people, that it's very much not only is it sort of quite heteronormative, but the expectation that heterosexual relationship will lead to marriage and to children, and she, in a sense, herself is slightly trapped by this. It's a reminder that, in the end, while Willie Russell might say that the middle classes are more culpable, certainly I think he is not uncritical of all of society as a whole. Mrs. Johnstone continues anyway and says, yeah. Hey, it's weird though, isn't it? Here's you can't have kids, and me, I can't stop having them. My husband used to say that all we had to do was shake hands and I'd be in the club." Note the idiom there again. "He must have shook hands with me before he left. I'm having another one, you know." "Oh, I see." "Oh, but look, it's all right, Mrs. Lyons. I'll still be able to do me work. Having babies is like clockwork to me. I'm back on my feet and working the next day, you know. If I have this one at the weekend, I won't even need to take one day off. I love this job, you know. We can just manage to get by now." So, the kind of contrast between them once again. Mrs. Johnstone's fertility and Mrs. Lyons' infertility. and Mrs Johnston's desperation to keep the work that is just holding her family together, just managing. And again, that's all her ambition is. In the same way that she's not asking for champagne and caviar, all she's asking is for a job that will allow her to just manage, because that's better than just not managing. She is stopped by Mrs Lyons putting the contents of the package, a pair of new shoes, on the table. Jesus Christ, Mrs Lyons, what are you trying to do? My God, what's wrong? The shoes, the shoes. Pardon? New shoes on the table, take them off. Mrs Lyons does so. Mrs Johnston, relieved, says, Oh God, Mrs Lyons, never put new shoes on the table. You never know what'll happen. Mrs Lyons, twigging it, laughing, says, Oh, you mean you're superstitious? Mrs Johnston says, No, but you never put new shoes on the table. Mrs Lyons says, Oh, go on with you. Look, if it will make you any happier, I'll put them away. Now, the theme of superstition, then, is an interesting one in this play. I think actually it's often overstated, but it is quite interesting. So, the first question then is, why do we have superstitions? Well, the argument is that a superstition is something that you have that helps you to make sense of the world around you when it seems to defy sense. In other words, it's a refuge of people who are disempowered, who are powerless, that they cling to things like that because it is more comforting to think that the world has some order than to think that everything is random and meaningless. That's why superstition is important. At this point in the play, Mrs Johnston is the disempowered one. She is the one who is weak and poor, and she is the one who clings to superstition. However, by later on in the play, we start to see that actually it is Mrs Lyons who becomes superstitious, and that's very interesting because it reflects the way that, as a result of her guilt, she herself has gone on to become superstitious. She herself is now weakened by it. She exits with the shoes. Music is heard as Mrs Johnston warily approaches the table, and the narrator enters. Now, we talked about the narrator in his black suit, and we talked about him as this rather fateful and doom-laden presence, and I think that applies here, because he sings this song, There's shoes upon the table and joker in the pack, the salt's been spilled and a looking glass cracked, there's one lone magpie overhead. So in other words, he's listing all these things that are deemed to be causes of bad luck. At this point, there's a sort of an alienating element that will creep in, because we have Mrs Johnston and the narrator interacting, because we have Mrs Johnston saying, I'm not superstitious, the mother said. I'm not superstitious, the mother said. Even though the narrator is this kind of slightly unearthly presence that's not really a part of the action, I suppose in a sense we can see him as a kind of analogue to the sort of gods of Greek tragedy. But yes, by breaking that once again, Rex emphasises the theatricality, and he emphasises the alienation that we're meant to feel, reminding us that this is not real, so that we can concentrate on the messages in hand. Now, we'll leave this video here on page 10, and we will pick up once again in my next video. Thank you very much indeed.